Man helps a crying grizzly bear. What it did next left him speechless. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly before Ethan as he moved through the dense undergrowth, his boots crunching against the frostbitten ground. The towering pines whispered with the wind, their branches heavy with snow, while the distant peaks of the Absaroka Range stood stark and unmoving against the overcast sky. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar comfort to Ethan after years of working as a park ranger. Winter had settled over the land, bringing with it an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional rustle of a hidden creature. Ethan adjusted his rifle strap across his back, though he had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. Encounters with bears, wolves, and cougars were part of the job, but he had always preferred observation over confrontation. His job was to protect the land and its creatures, to ensure that balance was maintained between nature and the people who ventured into it. As he continued his patrol, scanning the ground for signs of poachers or lost hikers, a strange sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't the distant howl of a wolf or the high-pitched cry of an eagle. It was something raw, something filled with pain. Ethan froze, his senses sharpening. It was an animal, that much was clear, but it wasn't the typical distress call of an injured deer or the warning growl of a predator. This was different. He moved carefully in the direction of the sound, his breath visible in the crisp air. The further he walked, the louder the cry became, a mix of a whimper and a groan, something small yet desperate. His heartbeat quickened as he pushed through a thick wall of frost-covered brush and emerged into a small clearing near a half-frozen creek. His eyes locked onto the source of the sound, and his stomach clenched. A bear cub. The small creature lay half-submerged in the snow, its chocolate-brown fur matted and damp. Its front paw was twisted awkwardly, pinned beneath the cruel jaws of a steel poacher's trap. The cub's dark eyes were wide with pain, its little body trembling violently as it tried in vain to free itself. The sight sent a wave of anger rolling through Ethan. He had spent years patrolling this land, working to keep it safe from people who saw nature as nothing more than a resource to exploit. And yet, despite the best efforts of conservationists, poachers still found ways to spread their cruelty. Ethan crouched slowly, his movements careful. A trapped bear, even a cub, could be dangerous. The mother had to be nearby. He scanned the tree line, his fingers tightening on the rifle strap over his shoulder. The cub let out another pitiful whimper, its small body sagging with exhaustion. Where was its mother? Ethan took a step closer, eyes darting to the surrounding trees. If the mother bear was anywhere near, she would be watching, waiting for the right moment to charge. But the forest remained silent. No shadowed figure lurked beyond the trees, no heavy footfalls disturbed the snow. He frowned. A cub this young wouldn't be wandering alone. Something had happened. Gritting his teeth, Ethan knelt beside the trap, his heart aching at the way the cub flinched. "Easy, little one," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." The cub let out a weak growl, baring tiny teeth, but there was no real strength behind it. Its breath came in short, ragged gasps, and Ethan could see the deep red welts where the metal teeth of the trap bit into its flesh. He had to act fast. The longer the cub stayed trapped, the worse its chances of survival became. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a thick cloth and carefully draped it over the cub's eyes. It was a trick he had learned early in his career. Blindfolding an animal in distress often helped keep it calm. The cub let out a startled huff but didn't struggle. Ethan took a deep breath and gripped the rusted steel trap. Years of exposure to the elements had made the mechanism stiff, but he had dealt with enough of these to know how to work them open. Bracing himself, he applied steady pressure to the release mechanism. The trap groaned in protest before finally snapping open with a sharp clang. The cub yanked its paw back with a pained whimper, curling into itself. Ethan wasted no time. He reached for a small bottle of antiseptic from his pack, dabbing it onto a clean cloth. "I know this is going to sting, buddy, but we need to keep that wound clean," he murmured. The cub flinched as Ethan gently pressed the cloth to the torn skin. It let out a soft, tired growl, but there was no fight left in it. With the worst of the wound cleaned, Ethan took off his glove and carefully ran his fingers over the cub's ribs, checking for any other injuries. Aside from the paw, the little bear seemed underfed but otherwise unharmed, and that only deepened his concern. A mother bear would never abandon her cub unless she was dead or something had scared her away. Ethan sat back on his heels, looking down at the small creature curled against the snow. He could leave it here, let nature take its course. That was the way of the wild, after all. But as he watched the cub's sides rise and fall with uneven breaths, he knew he couldn't. This wasn't nature's doing. This was human cruelty. And if humans had caused this suffering, then it was his responsibility to set things right. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Guess we're in this together now," he muttered. Gently, he lifted the cub, tucking it into his thick jacket to keep it warm. The little body trembled against his chest, but it made no effort to fight him, it was too weak. Ethan stood, glancing once more at the trees. Still no sign of a mother bear. With a final look at the discarded trap, a cruel, rusted thing now lying useless in the snow, Ethan turned and began the long trek back to his cabin, the small, injured cub nestled against him. Whatever had happened to this little one's mother was a mystery he might never solve. But for now, the only thing that mattered was keeping it alive. The storm outside howled against the wooden walls of Ethan's cabin, rattling the window panes as the wind carried snow in thick, blinding sheets across the Montana wilderness. Inside, however, the air was warm, the crackling fire in the stone hearth casting a flickering orange glow over the rustic interior. Ethan moved carefully, his breath still visible in the cold air as he set the small, injured cub down on a thick pile of blankets near the fire. The bear shivered violently, its damp fur still clinging to its frail frame, the wound on its paw already swollen from the time spent in the poacher's trap. Ethan crouched beside it, rubbing his hands together to warm them before gently brushing the melting ice from the cub's matted fur. "You're a tough little guy," he murmured, watching as the bear flinched but made no attempt to move away. That, more than anything, worried him. A healthy cub, even injured, should have fought, should have at least tried to snap at him or scramble for cover. But this one, Finn, he decided then and there, was too weak. Too drained of the fire and instinct that should have burned in a wild creature's eyes. Ethan sighed, reaching into the medical kit he always kept stocked. He had treated his fair share of injured animals before, an owl with a broken wing, a fox with a deep gash along its flank, but never a bear cub. The closest he had ever come was when he had to help tranquilize and relocate an adult grizzly that had wandered too close to a hiking trail. And even then, he had never been the one responsible for its well-being. Shaking off the doubt creeping into his mind, he pulled out a fresh cloth and a small bottle of antiseptic. "This is going to sting, bud, but we got to clean you up," he said, pouring the liquid onto the cloth. As soon as he pressed it to Finn's wounded paw, the cub let out a sharp, pitiful cry, its body twitching as it instinctively tried to pull away. Ethan let it, giving Finn a moment before reaching out again, slower this time, murmuring in a soothing voice, I know. I'm sorry. Just a little more. The cub trembled under his touch but allowed him to continue. Ethan worked quickly, cleaning out the wound before wrapping it carefully in a strip of gauze. Once satisfied, he leaned back, resting his hands on his knees as he studied the little bear. Finn lay curled into himself, his breath coming in short, uneven puffs. His fur, though still damp, had begun to fluff back up now that he was out of the cold, and his small, rounded ears twitched slightly as he adjusted to the warmth of the cabin. Ethan watched him for a long moment, his own body finally registering the exhaustion creeping through his limbs. He had barely realized how long he had been out in the storm until now. His fingers were stiff, his toes numb inside his thick boots, and his shoulders ached from carrying Finn over miles of frozen terrain. With a heavy sigh, he stood, stretching before heading toward the small kitchen tucked into the corner of the cabin. Pulling open a cupboard, he searched for anything that might work as food for a bear cub. He had dried meats, cans of beans, and packs of instant coffee, but nothing that would be suitable for a young grizzly. His eyes landed on a half-finished jar of honey shoved into the back of the shelf. He hesitated. It wasn't ideal. Cubs Finn's age would still be nursing if their mother was around, but it was better than nothing. Retrieving a small bowl, he drizzled a thin layer of honey into it before kneeling beside Finn again, setting the bowl down just within reach. The cub sniffed the air, his black nose twitching, before he sluggishly lifted his head. For a moment, he simply stared at the bowl, his dark eyes glazed with exhaustion. Ethan held his breath, then slowly, Finn nudged forward, his tiny pink tongue flicking out to lap at the honey. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. That's it, buddy. You got to eat something, he encouraged. Finn took a few more hesitant licks before resting his head back down, clearly too tired to do much more. Ethan sighed, leaning back against the couch. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind rattling the shutters with enough force to make Ethan grateful he had reinforced them before the season started. The snow would be deep by morning, likely trapping him here for a few days, but he didn't mind, not now. His mind drifted back to the clearing where he had found Finn, the empty silence of the forest, the complete absence of a mother bear. It didn't sit right with him. Mother bears were fiercely protective of their cubs, they didn't simply vanish. Either something had scared her off, which was unlikely, or she was dead. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. If she had fallen victim to the same poachers who had set the trap, then Finn had been orphaned in the cruelest way. Anger simmered beneath his exhaustion. He had spent years fighting to keep this land safe, yet people like that still slipped through the cracks. He would have to report the trap to the ranger station once the storm cleared, see if they could track whoever had set it, though deep down, he knew the chances of catching them were slim. A soft wheezing sound pulled him from his thoughts. Finn had shifted slightly, his small body rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his paws tucked close to his chest. He was asleep. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. The logical part of his mind told him he needed to figure out what to do next. He couldn't keep a bear cub here forever. Once Finn healed, he would have to find a way to reintroduce him to the wild, get him to a rehabilitation center or something. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, as the fire crackled and the wind howled against the walls, Ethan allowed himself to simply sit in the quiet. He watched the little bear curled up beside the hearth, the soft glow of the flames casting shadows over his small, fragile frame. He had no idea what the future held for Finn or for himself, but one thing was certain: tonight, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Morning came slowly, a soft grey light creeping through the frost-lined windows of the cabin, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in thick, untouched snow. The howling winds had faded into silence, the kind that only winter could bring, a hush so profound it made the entire wilderness feel frozen in time. Ethan stirred from the couch, muscles stiff from a restless night, his ears immediately attuned to the faint rhythmic breathing coming from the blankets near the fire. Finn lay curled tightly, his small body rising and falling in steady motions, his injured paw still wrapped in gauze. For a moment, Ethan simply watched him, studying the way the cub's nose twitched in his sleep, the way his rounded ears flicked at some invisible sound. There was something oddly peaceful about having another living thing in the cabin, a presence beyond the usual quiet solitude that had defined Ethan's life for years. Pushing himself up with a low groan, Ethan stretched, his joints cracking as he made his way toward the kitchen. He had no real plan for the day, the snow would be too deep to do much of anything, and even if he could get to the ranger station, he wasn't sure what he'd say. Keeping a wild animal, especially a bear, was not exactly protocol. But he also couldn't bring himself to leave Finn to fend for himself in the freezing wilderness, not when the cub was still too weak to stand for long. He rummaged through the cabinets, pulling out the same honey jar from the night before, pouring another thin layer into a small dish before setting it near Finn's nose. The cub stirred slightly, blinking groggily before his dark eyes found the food. Slowly, carefully, he stretched his head forward, his tiny tongue flicking out to lap at the sweet syrup. Ethan exhaled in relief. Good. He was eating again. Stepping away, Ethan grabbed his coat and pushed open the cabin door, greeted by an icy gust of air that stole the breath from his lungs. Snowdrifts piled high against the porch, the trees weighed down with thick layers of white. The world outside was untouched, no tracks, no sign of movement, just a vast, frozen stillness. He scanned the landscape out of habit, his ranger instincts searching for anything out of place, anything unusual, but nothing stirred. No birds flitted between the branches, no deer moved through the underbrush, and most notably, no sign of a mother bear searching for her lost cub. The thought gnawed at him as he leaned against the doorframe, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. It had been long enough. If she were alive, she would have come by now. Stepping back inside, Ethan shut the door against the cold, his mind already turning over the possibilities. He could try to get a signal on the radio, report the situation to the main station, but he knew how that would go. They would tell him to take Finn to a wildlife rehab facility, and that would be the end of it. The logical part of him knew it was the right decision. Bears were not pets, and Finn needed to be around his own kind. But something deep in his gut resisted the idea. The cub had been through so much already, torn from his mother, trapped and alone in the storm, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that handing him over would be another kind of abandonment. Finn shifted again, his small body stretching slightly before he settled back into his nest of blankets. His wounded paw twitched, a soft whimper escaping his mouth, and Ethan felt an unexpected tug in his chest. He had spent years in this wilderness, watching from a distance, keeping nature at arm's length because that was how it was supposed to be. Yet here he was, his cabin now home to a creature that, by all logic, should have been left to fate. Sighing, Ethan ran a hand through his hair before crouching beside the cub. "All right, Finn," he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. "Looks like you're stuck with me for a while." The cub didn't respond, still half asleep, his tiny ears flicking at the sound of Ethan's voice. The day passed slowly, the storm's remnants keeping them both confined indoors. Ethan spent most of it tending to Finn, making sure he was warm and fed, checking his wound for signs of infection. Every so often, he would glance out the window, scanning the horizon, but the forest remained still. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the light had begun to fade into the golden hues of evening, that Finn finally showed signs of real strength. Ethan had been working near the fire, sorting through old gear, when he heard a rustling behind him. Turning, he found Finn struggling to his feet, his tiny claws scraping against the wooden floor as he attempted to stand. The cub wobbled, his injured paw barely touching the ground, but there was determination in his dark eyes. Ethan remained still, watching, waiting. Finn took a shaky step forward, then another, his small frame swaying as he adjusted to his own weight. It wasn't much, but it was something. A smile ghosted across Ethan's lips. "That's it, little guy," he said quietly, leaning back against the couch. "You're getting there." Finn managed a few more steps before exhaustion took over, his legs giving out as he collapsed back onto the blankets with a huff. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Baby steps, huh?" He didn't know why he was talking to a bear cub like it could understand him, but it felt natural, like filling the quiet wasn't so strange anymore. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself sitting by the fire, Finn curled up a few feet away, his small body twitching in sleep. Outside, the temperature dropped, the world growing colder under the weight of the night. Ethan reached for his mug of coffee, taking a slow sip as he stared into the flames, his mind drifting. He thought about the first time he had ever encountered a bear in the wild, years ago when he was still new to the job. It had been a mother and her two cubs, moving through the valley with a quiet, effortless grace. He had watched from a safe distance, marveling at the way she guided them, the way they instinctively followed her lead. It had been a moment of pure connection, of understanding his place in this vast, untamed land. And now, here he was, sitting in his cabin with a motherless cub, unsure of what came next. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb against the rim of his mug. He had always been content with solitude, with the predictable rhythm of his life in the wilderness. But something about Finn's presence felt different. Maybe it was the way the cabin didn't seem quite as empty, or the way the quiet no longer felt so heavy. He didn't know. All he knew was that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a hurry for the silence to return. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Ethan leaned back against the couch, watching the little bear sleep, knowing that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The morning light seeped through the cabin windows, casting a pale glow over the wooden floor. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. Ethan stirred, stretching his stiff limbs before glancing over at the small pile of blankets near the fireplace. Finn was still curled up, his small body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths, the wound on his paw still wrapped in gauze. Outside, the world remained buried under the storm's aftermath, the snow glistening untouched beneath the cold blue sky. The air smelled crisp, fresh, the way it always did after a hard winter storm. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before swinging his legs off the couch and pushing himself to his feet. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb Finn, as he stepped toward the kitchen. He needed coffee, strong and black, something to shake off the remnants of sleep still clinging to his mind. As the water heated on the stove, he turned his attention back to the bear cub, Studying the way Finn's nose twitched slightly in his sleep, the small way his paws twitched like he was dreaming of running. It had only been a few days since Ethan had found him, but already the little bear seemed stronger. Pouring himself a mug of coffee, Ethan leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the endless stretch of white. He would need to check the perimeter today, see if there had been any damage from the storm. The ranger station would expect a report, and though he had been avoiding it, he knew he needed to decide what to do about Finn sooner rather than later. The bear couldn't stay here forever. The thought made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like. He pushed it aside, taking another sip of coffee before setting the mug down and moving toward the door. The cold hit him instantly as he stepped outside, the air sharp against his skin. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way toward the edge of the tree line, scanning the area for any disturbances. Everything seemed quiet, untouched, no tracks, no sign of movement, not even the usual rustling of small animals foraging through the underbrush. He exhaled, his breath forming a mist in the air. Something didn't sit right. The forest was too still. Turning back toward the cabin, he hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a faint indentation in the snow near the tree line, a track, large and deep. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer, crouching down to examine it. A bare print, fresh enough that the edges hadn't been softened by the wind. A mother bear wouldn't leave her cub unless something forced her to, but if she was still out there, it meant she had survived. It meant she might still be looking for Finn. Ethan straightened, scanning the tree line again. Nothing moved, but the feeling in his gut didn't ease. He needed to be careful. If the mother bear was still nearby, she could be unpredictable, desperate. He turned and made his way back toward the cabin, his mind racing. If Finn's mother was still alive, then everything changed. It meant Finn had a chance to return to where he belonged. It meant Ethan would have to let him go. The thought shouldn't have unsettled him as much as it did. Inside, Finn had woken, stretching his small limbs before letting out a soft, sleepy noise. Ethan knelt beside him, offering a quiet smile. "Looks like you're getting stronger, buddy." The cub blinked up at him, sniffing the air before slowly shifting to sit up. His injured paw barely touched the ground, but at least he wasn't curling it against his body anymore. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "I found something outside," he murmured, more to himself than the bear. "Might be your mother's tracks." He expected to feel relief at the thought, a sense of duty fulfilled, but instead, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. He had spent years telling himself that he was fine alone, that the solitude of the wilderness was exactly what he wanted. Yet, in just a few days, the cabin had begun to feel different, less empty. Finn watched him quietly, his dark eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't quite name. He exhaled, rubbing a hand through his hair before pushing himself back to his feet. "Come on," he said, grabbing his coat. "Let's see if you're ready to walk a little." Bundling up against the cold, Ethan carefully scooped Finn up and stepped outside. The cub squirmed slightly before settling against Ethan's chest, his nose twitching as he sniffed the crisp air. Ethan carried him a few yards away from the cabin before setting him down in a relatively flat patch of snow. Finn hesitated, his little claws digging into the frozen ground before he took a tentative step forward. His injured paw barely touched the snow, but he didn't stumble. He took another step, then another, his body swaying slightly as he adjusted to the weight shift. Ethan crouched nearby, watching. "That's it, buddy. You got this." Finn moved slowly at first, testing his footing before gaining confidence. He sniffed at the air, his little ears twitching as he took in the unfamiliar scents. Then, suddenly, he froze, his entire body going still, nose pointed toward the tree line. Ethan followed his gaze, his stomach tightening. A shape moved between the trees, large, silent. Ethan's pulse spiked. The mother bear. She stood just beyond the edge of the forest, her massive frame blending into the shadows, her dark eyes locked onto Finn, her breath visible in the cold air. Finn let out a small, uncertain sound, his body tense as he stared back at her. The air between them felt electric, charged with something ancient and instinctual. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. This was what he had been hoping for, what Finn needed. A chance to go home. But now that the moment was here, a part of him wanted to hold on to the cub just a little longer. The mother bear took a cautious step forward, her muscles rippling beneath her thick coat. Finn trembled, shifting his weight, torn between familiarity and fear. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. If he intervened now, if he scared her off, he might ruin Finn's only chance at reuniting with her. The wind shifted, carrying Finn's scent toward her. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling sound, something between a growl and a whimper. Finn twitched, his small ears flicking at the sound, and then, slowly, he moved. Step by step, Finn limped toward her, his tiny body dwarfed by the vastness of the wild stretching behind her. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched. The mother bear lowered her head, her dark eyes softening as Finn reached her. She sniffed him, nudging him gently before wrapping her large paw around him, pulling him close. Ethan exhaled, his breath shaky. It was over. Finn had found his way home. The mother bear looked up, her gaze meeting Ethan's for just a moment. Then, without another sound, she turned, disappearing into the trees, Finn pressed against her side. Ethan stood there long after they had gone, the wind biting at his skin, the silence pressing in. The cabin behind him felt emptier than it had in years, but deep down, he knew this was the way it was meant to be. Finn belonged to the wild, and the wild had finally come back for him. The cabin felt unbearably silent. Ethan sat on the porch, staring out at the stretch of white wilderness, his breath curling in soft clouds against the frigid air. The tracks leading into the trees had already begun to fade beneath a fresh dusting of snow, but he could still see them if he looked hard enough, a path disappearing into the dense forest, leading Finn back to where he belonged. His chest ached in a way he hadn't expected, an unfamiliar hollow settling deep in his ribs. It was the right thing, letting Finn go, reuniting him with his mother. But damn, it stung. He brought the tin mug of coffee to his lips, the warmth barely registering as he took a slow sip. The fire inside still crackled, the only sound beyond the distant rustle of wind through the pines. He had spent years in this wilderness, always alone, always content in his solitude. Yet now, the emptiness gnawed at him, the absence of small shuffling paws, the quiet huffs and soft, sleepy murmurs that had filled the space over the past few days. It was remarkable how quickly one could grow accustomed to companionship, how something as simple as a bear cub's presence could shift the way a place felt. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and frozen earth, and he found himself glancing toward the tree line again, as if expecting to see a familiar small figure hesitating just beyond the edge. But there was nothing. Finn was gone. He belonged to the wild now. That was the way of things. Ethan inhaled deeply, then pushed himself up, dusting the snow from his knees before heading inside. He needed to keep busy, needed to shake the lingering ache that threatened to settle into his bones. He gathered his gear, pulling on his coat and thick gloves before stepping back out into the cold. There were tasks to be done, repairs to the radio, checking the perimeter for more signs of poachers, making sure the wildlife in the area was undisturbed after the storm. Routine was good, routine kept his mind occupied. The morning passed in a blur of movement, his hands busy with small, necessary work. He checked the traps, not for catching but for tracking, small markers meant to indicate if larger predators had passed through. There were no fresh signs of wolves, only faint prints of deer moving cautiously through the snow. He adjusted the logs stacked against the side of the cabin, reinforcing the tarp to keep them dry, his mind barely registering the work. Still, every so often, he found himself pausing, scanning the forest, listening, but the only sound was the wind. By midday, he made his way toward the ridge where he had first found Finn, the memory pressing against him with an unexpected weight. The old, rusted trap was still there, half buried in snow, its sharp metal teeth coated in ice. His jaw tightened as he bent down, carefully dislodging it from the frozen earth. The cruelty of it burned through him, a slow, simmering anger. He had seen too many of these, too many scars left behind by people who saw the land as something to be taken from rather than protected. He slung the trap over his shoulder, carrying it with him as he made his way back down the slope. It would be reported, collected, dealt with, but it wouldn't erase the damage it had already done. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time he reached the cabin again, the sky painted in muted hues of orange and purple. He set the trap aside near the shed, deciding he'd deal with it later. Right now, all he wanted was to sit, to let the exhaustion settle into his limbs. He stepped back onto the porch, pausing as something caught his attention, a sound, soft, barely there, carried on the breeze. A low, rhythmic huffing, the unmistakable weight of heavy footsteps pressing into the snow. His breath hitched, his pulse quickening as he turned toward the tree line, and there, standing just at the edge of the forest, was Finn. Ethan's heart stumbled in his chest, a sharp, unexpected ache blooming in his ribs. The cub stood motionless, his dark eyes locked onto Ethan's, his small, rounded ears twitching as if uncertain. He had grown just in the short time since leaving, his coat thicker, his posture stronger, but there was no mistaking him. Ethan took a slow step forward, not daring to breathe. Finn, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the cub's ears flicked at the sound. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, Finn took a step forward, then another. He stopped just a few yards away, his nose twitching, his breath visible in the frigid air. Ethan could see it now, the wildness in him, the way he stood with more confidence, no longer the weak, injured cub Ethan had once carried through the snow. And yet, despite it all, he had come back. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What are you doing, bud?" he murmured, shaking his head. "You're supposed to be out there with your family." Finn blinked, then made a soft noise, something between a chuff and a huff, his small claws flexing against the snow. Ethan crouched, holding out a gloved hand instinctively, though he knew better than to expect anything. Finn hesitated, then took another step closer, but just as quickly as he moved forward, he stopped again, his head turning back toward the trees. And that's when Ethan saw her. The mother bear stood just beyond the clearing, watching. She was massive, her thick fur dusted with frost, her dark eyes keen and alert. Ethan's stomach clenched, instinct telling him to back away, to give her space. But she didn't move. She simply stood, waiting. Finn let out another small sound, his gaze flicking between Ethan and his mother. There was a moment of hesitation, something unreadable in the way he lingered. But then, finally, he turned. He padded back toward her, each step slow, deliberate, as if he wasn't quite ready to leave just yet. When he reached her side, she nudged him gently with her snout, then looked once more at Ethan before turning and disappearing into the trees, her cub following at her heels. Ethan stood frozen, watching as the forest swallowed them whole, the tracks they left behind already beginning to fade beneath the falling snow. His chest felt tight, but this time, it wasn't from sorrow. It was something else, something deeper, something that settled in his bones with a quiet kind of warmth. Finn had come back, not to stay, not to return to the cabin, but just to say goodbye. Ethan exhaled a slow, steady breath. He had spent years living in this wilderness, believing he was only a watcher, an observer of nature's ebb and flow. But now he knew better. He had been part of something rare, something real, a connection unspoken but undeniable. Turning back toward the cabin, he stepped onto the porch, glancing once more toward the trees. The forest remained silent, but it no longer felt empty. With a small, knowing smile, Ethan opened the door, stepping inside, letting the warmth of the fire welcome him home. This story is a testament to the deep and unspoken bond that can exist between humans and nature. Ethan's journey with Finn reminds us that kindness and compassion transcend species and that even in the vast wilderness, connection can be found in the most unexpected places. It teaches us that sometimes the hardest thing we can do is let go, but true love, whether for a person, an animal, or a place, means giving others the freedom to find their own path. Finn's return was not one of dependence but of gratitude, a reminder that the bonds we form, even briefly, leave lasting imprints on our hearts. Life often presents us with moments where we must choose between holding on and letting go. But as Ethan learned, real love is about trust, about believing that those we care for will find their way, even if it means walking away. Thank you for watching this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story and want more heartwarming tales of courage, friendship, and survival, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these unforgettable stories with you. See you in the next one.